is a guy who obviously knows Dana Holgorsen and Holgorsen's systems specifically. Okay, it's interesting with Garrett McGuire. I was going. He's a former college quarterback. He can bring value if he wants to stay on. He still has the option to stay at Nebraska in an adjusted role. Okay, so they haven't completely let him go. He's got the option to stay on. He did play quarterback in college, and so we'll see what happens with him in his future going forward. He just turned 25. He's a young man who's got a bright future ahead of him. His time is just not now to be a position-specific coach or the head of a full position group just yet, and that's okay. So I'm curious to see what's going on with him going forward. It was interesting. I remember when he was hired, all right, because it reminded me of when I was at the Rams. My D-line coach when I first got there, the first 2 years, was Brian Baker. That guy has coached now over 30 years in the NFL. He was very old school, very hard-nosed, not a guy you mess with. A couple of years in, I got a new D-line coach, Coach Daly. And he was younger than 3/4 of our starting defensive line. Now, granted, Leroy Glover was in his mid-30s. Leonard Little was in his mid-30s. James Hall, who played on that 97 Michigan team, was in his early 30s. And then I was the baby at like 24, I think. I might have been 23 still. And so 75% of our starting defensive line was older than Coach Daly, who was in his late 20s. And I had a hard time looking at him and taking him seriously. And I know they did as well. Now, I should mention Coach Daly's gone on to win I think 2 Super Bowls maybe. I know at least one later on in his career with the Patriots. I haven't kept in touch with him lately, but sometimes that can work against a guy. You're almost prejudged a little bit. But at the same time, we had talented receivers, big receivers who were all conference type receivers elsewhere who didn't fulfill their potential here at Nebraska. So it's a good move to bring in a new wide receivers coach. I wish Coach McGuire the best, whether he continues to stay here at Nebraska in some sort of capacity and or go somewhere else. Now, Dana Holgorsen. All right, Tony White's gone. I'm just going to offer some real quick thoughts as to why, he may or may not be gone. I got a couple of thoughts here. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. I wish him the best at Florida State. He drastically improved our defense immediately. All right. I know wasn't exactly thrilled when he wasn't consulted about John Butler being hired last summer. Probably wasn't thrilled about Phil Snow, even though he wasn't in the building at the facility, being a consultant defensively from afar. All right. And, some people look at Florida State as a lateral move to Nebraska. I in my own mind, obviously Florida State's warmer weather, things of that nature. You're going to play a much easier schedule if that conference even exists in a couple of years. There's a couple of thoughts there. For me, I could go either way. I see pluses or minuses. I also see Nebraska in the Big Ten, which is a much more stable conference, a much more stable situation. You're going to make much more money. Now, maybe Florida State's joining the Big Ten in the next year or two, and we just don't know it, or the SEC. I doubt if they're going to be one of those teams left out in the cold. I do know from time to time over the past year, there was a little bit of clashing of the heads with Coach Knight and Coach White and a couple of folks down there. And it's interesting with Coach Knighton. You go back to last summer when he changed his entire X profile. And then, some things got changed back and the CEO of Death Row and all that. When I saw that, I was like, yeah, that means something. That means something. And so when I saw there's a chance he may or may not be going with Coach White, we'll see how this all unfolds. And when everything's finalized, when we get to that point, I wasn't entirely shocked, but we'll see what happens ultimately with Coach Knight. And obviously Coach White is going to Florida State. But there is a few more things that go on with Coach White. I've kind of alluded to him here, but again, wish him the best. I don't want to spend too much time on that. The big news of yesterday was retaining Dana Holgorsen. This is an individual who has never had an offense when he's the coordinator. All right. He's been a head coach, brings 32 years of collegiate coaching experience to the Huskers staff, 13 years as a head coach. All right, he was also a position coach as a quarterbacks coach and a wide receivers coach throughout his career as well, but he was a specific offensive coordinator for 6 seasons as well. He is a guy that has never had an offense. When he's the offensive coordinator, finished lower than 3rd in passing in America. Okay, the average is number 2 in America as far as being a passing offense. Okay, when he's the offensive coordinator. Think about it, in America, not in the conference, in the country. All right. And when it comes to total offense, they're 3rd on average in total offense. All right. And 6th in the country in scoring. when he's the offensive coordinator throughout his 6 years as being a specifically an OC. He's also coached the all-time FBS leader in touchdown passes, the all-time FBS leader in total offense, the FBS season record holder in completions. All right, and he was a coordinator for 2 of the top 4 passing offenses in FBS history. So to me, there's a lot of stats that have been talked about him. I hadn't heard those specifically put together like that. And so to me, there's things to be excited about. I think we're going to have more of an identity going forward. It's going to be pass first. It's going to be passes as an extension of the run game. And I'm okay with that, because if that's who he is and that's what he does, and by God, let's do that. And I do think our yards per carry average will go up, even though we may not run the ball as much. If you're scoring, people are going to be okay with that. All right, so when you think about the transfer portal, obviously Daniel Kalen has entered today. This is a guy that Matt Rule has looked right at me and said he's an NFL quarterback. Right, he's got an NFL potential written all over him, NFL arm. All right, and this is a guy who's entered the portal as of today. Not a shock, fairly predictable. I got nothing but love. He switched from Missouri to Nebraska when the quarterback position was open in his recruiting class. And then when Dylan decided to come to Nebraska, he stayed the course. He did a bunch of peer recruiting. A lot of last year's class was influenced by Daniel Kalen to come here throughout this entire season. Doesn't say a peep, doesn't complain, red shirts, and now he's got 4 years to play. I believe we're past all that COVID eligibility stuff, so nobody's going to play for like 7, 8, 22 years anymore, I believe. So he's got 4 years left to play, and he's a guy I'm going to be rooting for in the future, and I'm excited to see what he can do because he's very, very talented. Also, Prince William and Yillen, want to wish him the best as well. It's tough. It's tough. When Jamari Butler, all right, the guy I saw yesterday, when you see these guys who've started for us, who have talent, who are young, who have a bright future, and they're entering the portal, it is tough. It does not make Nebraska better. But the one thing I look around and I say is it's going to happen to every school, which is why being a college football coach, by God, is harder than it's ever been. I don't even know that coaching is like half the gig anymore. It's managing an entire, basically corporation is what they've become. It's a multi-billion-dollar business is what college football is. And that's basically what you're doing. And then you've got to recruit high school kids, other schools' kids, transfer portal, and your own kids. And then you've got to manage everything. You've got to manage a roster. It's why college football teams, including Nebraska, now have a GM. I never heard of a GM in college football until about a year ago. And when Nebraska hired one, I was like, yep, that was a good hire. Because you now need those things. I think with Dana, one of the things that excites me a lot, I was hopeful he would improve our offense at the end of the year last year. I was. I didn't know how realistic it was. I just didn't in such a short time frame. And granted, Wisconsin's not a great team. But what we saw within 2 weeks, and I talked about from game 1 to game 2 is probably going to be the biggest improvement under Dana Holgorsen as the OC. From game 1 to game 2, well, that was USC to Wisconsin. That was the biggest improvement. Maybe Wisconsin was the least effective of the 3 opponents as well. But defensively, they were the 3rd best statistical defense we played all year. Right, their offense was what was really struggling for the most part throughout the season. And you look at what they did, and you look how quickly it happened, and you looked at the tempo and the physicality that changed in the trenches on the offensive line. Now, the offensive line wasn't without flaws in that Wisconsin game, but the pass protection was so much better. I think out of all of Dylan Raiola's passes that day, he wasn't sacked once, and I think he was hurried only 4 times. Wasn't knocked down at all. So the O-line played better. And it's interesting to me because when one guy comes in, and there's an obvious drastic improvement, and it happens that quickly, and there's still a lot that needs to be improved. And I will say this, going to Iowa, there were points left on the board that were not on Dana Holgorsen. He can only scheme people open so far. He can only put you in short field goal range so many times. Essentially, somebody's got to actually put it through the uprights, catch the ball, and not fumble the ball, whatever. But I look at what Dana did, and I'm like, it's awesome. But everybody else that was already here couldn't get that out of them. So to me, there has to be an insane evaluation of everybody on the entire coaching staff, especially that offensive staff. And I talked about the offensive line. And all of a sudden, why is the offensive line playing so much better? Because there's a new OC. To me, I looked at that and I'm like, man, that's awesome, Dana. But what about everybody else, like that had been here Some of them were doing a good job. Some of them, like the running backs, needed to play better. The wide receivers needed to play better. I just talked about how much better the offensive line played within a couple of weeks. Why weren't they doing that before? And so for me, that's kind of how, when I look at Holgorsen, I'm like, I'm excited. I'm curious to see what changes are or are not made in addition to the wide receivers coach throughout this offseason. We need the best coaches here. If they're already here, awesome. If there's little tweaks and adjustments that can be made, awesome. If we need to get someone else, then let's do that as well. Okay? I'm good with whatever. Dana Holgorsen is a guy who comes in with a lot of cachet, a proven history, and obviously it's someone the players are going to listen to because you don't change that drastically unless your mental approach changes. If you're an offensive player, because you're buying into the new guy that's telling you these things that he's saying. All right. What else we got here? Jake, you got anything else on the docket real quick? Probably head to break.
Yeah, not as far as news goes. It's been a slow 10 minutes.
Oh my! I see what you did there. I got a couple of final thoughts, then we will go to break. Some guys I would really like to keep. All right, Vincent Shavers, Ja'Cory Barney, who seemed very happy that Dana was signed back, so that seems good. Dylan Raiola, who should be very happy that Dana Holgorsen is here, and Willis McGahee, all young players. 2 of them linebackers, 2 of them on offense, affecting the passing game. There's people who are going to come and go, but we need to keep those players around and keep them here. And, you know, Nebraska's bowl eligible for the first time since 2016, and I have not even yet thrown out what the bowl projections are. Here's a couple of them. All right, the Rate Bowl versus Texas Tech, the Mayo Bowl, all right, versus Duke, Pinstripe Bowl versus Boston College, Pinstripe Bowl versus Duke, Music City Bowl versus LSU. Here's a couple other that I saw. All right, Duke versus Nebraska in the Duke's Mayo Bowl, and the Rate Bowl in Phoenix, Nebraska versus Texas Tech. So those kind of seem to be the most common. There's obviously other ones out there. Here's what I will say, and then we'll go to break. Obviously, struggles to win games in November. The games to let me start over. The games to remember are played in November, and also now when you get the college football playoff, December, but you got to get there first. 1-score losses, close losses, things of that nature. And Matt Rules, you know, had his struggles with those as well. No need to dive into the numbers for the 1 billionth time, but here's a number you might find interesting, including his entire head coaching career. There was a point in Rules' career before he came to Nebraska where he had won his last 38 games when leading entering the fourth quarter. 38 straight games his teams won prior to Nebraska. Obviously, every team's different, every conference is different, every situation is different. But there was a point in his career where his teams had won 38 straight games when leading entering the fourth quarter. That's the Matt Rule I want coaching our football team going forward.